For those that are unaware, I used to work for Night Flight. Yes, that Night Flight. This is the first in what I hope to be transcribing some of my Night Flight work into a video review. Abel Ferrara's The Driller Killer. This film should be played loud, announces a title card at the beginning of The Driller Killer, the first feature film directed by Abel Ferrara as Abel Ferrara. Once labeled the most controversial director in American cinema, Ferrara's humble start as a first-time director actually came earlier, when he directed, and also starred in, 9 Lives of a Wet Pussy, using the name Jimmy Boy L. The Driller Killer is a true punk film, not only in that it features a punk rock soundtrack, but also in its attitude. It's a film of intense power and anger, but there are also scenes of true beauty within the 84 minutes herein. The film is almost zen in its calculated bizarreness, violent artistry reeking of an id run amok. Many horror films, slasher films in particular, simply tell us something bad happened and that a killer was made. But The Driller Killer helps us note how this killer was made. It's oddly a more personal film. This has long been a staple in Ferrara's work. Ms. 45 and Bad Lieutenant similarly explored this same philosophy. In Ms. 45, the mute girl Thana is brutally raped, by Ferrara, ironically enough, twice in the same day, and proceeds to become not a vigilante as a Death Wish film might portray, but instead becomes a serial killer seeking to murder anything that happens to have a penis on it. Her entire mental journey is shown to us. We can't condone her actions, but we can understand why she feels these actions are necessary. Bad Lieutenant takes a comparable path of showing us the long line of things that have to go wrong to create the super corrupt and vile police detective in that film. Many Ferrara trademarks which would tag his career all begin here in Driller Killer. Blunt and subtle Catholic imagery, lesbians, random violence, non-professional actors, haphazard cutaways to non-sequitur moments, religious failings, and, most of all, the gritty urban hellscape featured in most of his original works. The Driller Killer is almost the very definition of sleaze. Few films are able to radiate such intensity solely on their visuals alone. You can almost feel the dirt and grime of the streets and the clubs and the images themselves, drenched in darkness with a wet sheen to everything. You can almost nearly smell the stale urine and dried sex in every frame of The Driller Killer. Considered one of the bloodiest films at the time of its release, the film is actually quite tame on the levels of gore. There's more of an implied groove factor than the bits that actually show up on screen. The movie is hardly subtle, but it's also oddly restrained. Filmed on and off between 1978 and 1979, if you watch the film you can see the hairstyles change back and forth. It had an estimated $20,000 budget, yet the Driller Killer feels like, and is edited very much like, porno film of the same era. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Lensed on 16mm with an almost documentary guerrilla style to it, this is an experimental film if there ever was one. Filled with scenes that would fit perfectly in a student film, contrasted with the obvious skill behind the camera by director and star Abel Ferrara. The film itself opens with Reno, played by Ferrara of course, who is credited here as Jimmy Lane, freaking out in a church when an old man touches his hand. The old man is said to have Reno's name and phone number in his pocket. This is never brought up again. It's implied the old man is his father, but it's merely implied. This is indicative of the entire movie. You do something, and then you move on to something else like the previous scene didn't happen. The movie is filled with scenes that go nowhere and serve no purpose, but which fuel the rebellious and renegade nature of the Driller Killer itself. The overall plot is that Reno, Ferrara, is very rapidly going insane for a number of reasons. His inability to create a painting which he's been commissioned to create, his girlfriend reconnecting with her old boyfriend, the very bad punk rock band living upstairs who only know 2 songs, one of which is highly derivative of the Peter Gunn theme, his girlfriend's female lover living with them, and his art dealer trying to screw him. Literally in this case. To relieve his stress and assuage the fear that he's becoming like that old man who touched him, who again may or may not be his father, we never find out, Reno buys a battery pack and a power drill and starts killing the homeless near him. Cathartic, really. According to Ferrara, the bum at the start of the film is Bruce Willis in his first film role. You can't see his face, and Willis says it's not him. I doubt it's him. Eventually, Reno, girls leave him, so revenge is necessary. Revenge against the society he feels has wronged him. The girl's lover buys it, and then the end. Literally. The last minute of this film sort of needs to be seen to be believed. It almost defines anticlimactic, and yet is so fitting an ending that you have to appreciate either the ineptitude of it or the sheer creativity of it. Considering the work Ferrara would unleash in the future, the latter is the more likely scenario. There are many things of note about the Driller Killer which make it stand out. One of the most unique elements is that nearly the entirety of the film's runtime is spent inside the head of our killer. We may not understand why he commits the heinous acts that occur, but we are led to understand why he feels he needs to do these vile things. Reno is a terrible human being in every aspect of his life, and is a shameful and pathetic excuse for a person, and yet Ferrara plays him as if he's a respectable and put upon every man that people should identify with. Reno happens to be one of the most unlikable characters that I've ever seen as a main character in a film. He's a thoroughly deplorable person with sociopathic tendencies and no redeeming qualities. The Driller Killer is an unremittingly depressing and dour film. This is another theme that Ferrara would use to great advantage later in his career. The decaying urban big city is also a recurring element of Ferrara's films, as he's chosen to examine the seedier and festering parts of the normally glamorous New York City, a rotten big apple, if you will. Ferrara would parlay the Driller Killer into work for Miami Vice after his next two films, Ms. 45 and Fear City, were modest hits. His career was on such an upswing that he was tasked with the 1993 Invasion of the Body Snatchers remake, simply titled Body Snatchers this time around, which led to him creating modern classics like Bad Lieutenant and King of New York, plus the insane drunk driver vigilante film The Gladiator. Then he would also give us less popular and more obscure work such as China Girl or Dangerous Game, as well as the, I have to admit, intriguing yet ultimately disappointing William Gibson adaptation New Rose Hotel. Nicholas St. John scripts the Driller Killer, and he would work with Ferrara on the vast majority of his output. In fact, St. John has no credits besides Ferrara films. Ferrara has cited Stanley Kubrick and Woody Allen as two of his biggest influences when it comes to film, and it's very much evident in the man's work despite those two names not really going together. Kubrick's lighting and overall style are clear inspirations to Ferrara, as are the Woody Allen approach to dialogue and film structure. Ferrara is known to have a temper on the set and treat his cast and crew in less than humane ways, which is another thing Ferrara sort of got from Stanley Kubrick. And speaking of his influences, being the neighbor to Andy Warhol surely rubbed off on Ferrara a little bit. Warhol's pop art approach would greatly impact Ferrara in terms of imagery and the visual makeup of shots in The Driller Killer. Now that I've said that, go back and look and you can kinda see it. And the punk rock band in the film is obviously an allegory to the New York Dolls, both visually and in musical execution. And remember that this being a 1979 film, it's right on the cusp of the new wave movement of punk rock being homogenized into a radio-friendly genre. The band, the Roosters, or the actual punk rock band, perfectly embody the New York punk scene at the time. Also, incidentally, the Roosters guitar player, D.A. Metrov, would go on to write the 1986 film Solar Babies for Mel Brooks, because why not? It is still a fascinating look at the first non-pornographic work of what would be one of the most interesting, and I use that word in all the ways it should be, filmmakers out there.